The first time I held my son, Leo, my wrists were cold with the steel of the handcuffs. They called me a monster, a wife who murdered her husband in his sleep. And in that moment, the sound of my son's first cry mingled with the click of the lock that would steal my life. My name is Claire Thompson. I was a chef. My husband, Mark, was my world. We were building a life, a home, a family. I believed in justice, in truth, in the idea that innocence was a shield. I believed this until the day the system looked into my eyes and lied, using my love as the murder weapon. That belief shattered with the sound of a cell door closing. The metallic echo became the only lullaby my son would ever hear from me. They took away my name and gave me a number, 734. The air here doesn't smell of life. It smells of cold iron, disinfectant, and the ghosts of forgotten prayers. They told me I would die in this place, that these walls would be my only witnesses. But they didn't understand. A mother's love doesn't die. It waits, it learns, and in the suffocating silence of a prison, it can become the most powerful weapon of all. The first night was a symphony of hell played in tones of iron and concrete. The cell wasn't a room, it was a sounding board for despair. The cold air, thick with the metallic smell of old blood and the chemical odor of cheap disinfectant, seemed to scrape my lungs with every breath. The metal bunk was icy to the touch, and the mattress, less than 2 inches thick, offered no comfort against the steel springs digging into my back. The fluorescent light in the hallway, a cruel, incessant sentinel, cast a pale, sickly streak across the cement floor, robbing me of even the privacy of darkness. My body, a postpartum battlefield, screamed in protest. The sharp pangs in my abdomen were a physical, visceral echo of the child ripped from me, a phantom pain where life had once been. The sound was a character in itself. The steady drip of a faucet somewhere in the block, the muffled wail of a woman in a distant cell, a dry coughing fit that echoed like a gunshot. And above all, the rhythmic, frightening sound of the guards' boots in the hallway, a metronome measuring time in units of fear and control, each step an affirmation of their power and my helplessness. I closed my eyes, but escape was impossible. The image of Leo's face, so small and vulnerable, was burned into my eyelids. I could feel his phantom weight in my arms, the warmth of his skin against mine, a warmth that lasted only a few precious minutes. My arms, now empty, ached with a longing that was more physical than emotional. The tears I'd held back in the courtroom, in front of the impassive faces judging me, now flowed freely, silently, soaking the pillow that smelled of mildew and the tears of countless women before me. It was a forced baptism into the sisterhood of misery. Somewhere, on the other side of these impenetrable walls, my son was breathing his first night's air, perhaps nestled in my sister's arms, and I wasn't there to protect him, to soothe him. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just imprisoned me. They'd amputated the most vital part of my soul, leaving me bleeding in a concrete box. I tried to wrap myself in the thin, rough blanket, but there was no warmth, only the piercing cold of the most absolute loneliness a human being can know. I was no longer Claire, the chef who found joy in creating, the wife who found comfort in love. My name, my story, my very essence had been confiscated at the gates of that prison, exchanged for a number and an orange uniform that seemed to suck all the color from my life. I was number 734. The repetition of that number in my mind was a form of self-hypnosis, an attempt to numb myself to reality. But the pain was too sharp. That first night, I understood the most brutal truth of that place. The worst cell is not made of bars, but of the vivid memory of what you just lost. The true sentence wasn't the 25 years to life the judge pronounced. It was every single second, every beat of my heart, lived in a universe parallel to my son's. Despair was a black tide, rising, threatening to drown me. And amidst that darkness, a spark of rage, small but fierce, ignited. They might have my body, but I swore, in a whisper to the cracked ceiling, that they would never have the woman who came before them. Leo's mother was still alive, and she would learn to fight in hell. Memories of the trial came in fragmented flashes, shards of a broken mirror reflecting a distorted reality. I saw myself sitting in the dock, wrapped in a borrowed suit that barely fit my postpartum body, feeling like a rag doll in a macabre play. The courtroom light was cold and unforgiving, stripping me of all dignity, exposing every pore of my suffering to public scrutiny. The prosecutor, a man with a thin smile and predatory eyes, held Mark's diary with his fingertips as if it were a toxic artifact. That diary, my birthday gift to him, a tool for him to vent his anxieties about work and the future, had been transformed into a lethal weapon against me. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," his voice echoed in the silent room, "here we have the confession. Not of the crime, but of the mind that committed it." He read my words of love and concern, twisting them, poisoning them, turning my anxiety about Mark's health into a controlling obsession, and our trivial arguments about finances into motives for murder. The real story, our complex and nuanced story, was completely silenced. No one wanted to hear about the shadows in Mark's past, the crippling stress he felt at the firm, the mysterious late-night calls he received that left him pale and shaky. No one cared when I tried to explain that the phrase, "Sometimes I feel like he's killing me with this worry," was the hyperbole of an exhausted wife, not the premeditation of a murderer. My own lawyer, an overworked and cynical public defender, advised me to remain silent, to appear meek, remorseful. "Remorseful of what?" I whispered to him, horrified. "Of loving him?" He just sighed, the sound of defeat. "Claire, the truth doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the story they believe." And the story they believed was that of a black widow, a modern-day Medea who killed her husband just before giving birth to her son, perhaps to collect his life insurance, perhaps out of pure malice. It was a simple, sensationalist, and, above all, facile narrative. Across the room, David, Mark's best friend and business partner, wept on the witness stand. He talked about Mark's loyalty, their shared dreams, and how he'd noticed my erratic behavior over the past few months. And as he spoke, he looked at me, just for a second, and in his eyes I saw the truth, a glint of cold, calculating triumph, but no one else did. They saw a friend in mourning. I was convicted not by a mountain of evidence, but by its absence. I was convicted by emptiness, by the most convenient story. When the jury returned and the foreman uttered the word "guilty," the sound in the room faded. All I could hear was the beating of my own heart, a slow drum marching toward a living death. In that moment, my faith in justice, a pillar that had sustained my entire life, didn't just crack, it crumbled, turning to dust. And in its place was born a cold, hard understanding. If justice is a lie, then the only truth left is revenge. The days blended into a gray, relentless routine, marked by the metallic sound of the bell at 5 a.m, a shrill call that ripped you from any dreams you dared to entertain. The prison had its own rhythm, a living, breathing organism with unwritten rules you learned quickly or suffer the consequences. The count, twice a day, was a ritual of dehumanization. Standing beside your bunk, hands visible as the guards passed by with blank eyes, counting bodies like cattle. Breakfast was always the same. Watery porridge, 2 pieces of dry bread, and coffee so weak it was more hot water than anything else. In the mess hall, the social map was a minefield. The veterans, the lifers, dominated the central tables. Gang leaders controlled salt and sugar, commodities more valuable than gold. Newbies like me learned to sit on the edges, eat quickly, and never, ever make prolonged eye contact with the wrong person. It was a daily lesson in hierarchy and survival. It was in this brutal ecosystem that I met Maria. She was a legend at Iowa State Penitentiary, serving a life sentence for a crime she committed as a young woman. She was 60 years old, with gray hair tied in a tight braid and eyes that held the wisdom and sadness of 1,000 lifetimes. She led not with violence, but with a quiet authority that no one dared challenge. She saw me on my first day in the laundry room, a hell of steam, noise, and the acrid smell of bleach where I struggled not to cry as my hands, unaccustomed to manual labor, turned red and raw. Another inmate tried to take my place at the ironing machine, shoving me with her shoulder. Before I could react, Maria's voice cut through the din. "Leave the girl alone, Sonia. She has enough of her own hell to deal with." Sonia backed away, grumbling. Later, Maria approached me, handing me a piece of cloth soaked in cold water. "The first rule," she said, her voice low and husky, "is that you show no pain. Ever. Pain is bait for sharks. The second rule is that you find a family. No one survives here alone." Under Maria's protection, I began to learn to navigate that world. She taught me the codes, how to tell when a guard was in a good mood, how to fold a letter so it could be hidden in the seam of a pair of pants, how to use the reflection in a puddle to see who was behind me. She was my mentor, my protector, the mother figure stolen from me twice, first by my own mother's death years before, and now by prison. Yet routine was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, its numbing monotony prevented me from thinking, from feeling the searing pain of Leo's absence. It was an anesthetic. On the other, I felt it erasing me, sanding away my rough edges, turning me into just another orange uniform, another number. I began to fear forgetting the smell of Mark's hair, the sound of my laughter, the texture of bread dough under my fingers. Routine was a form of slow death. And it was that fear, the fear of becoming the ghost they wanted me to be, that solidified the promise I made on my first night. I wouldn't just survive, I would remember. And I would use every memory as fuel for the fire that would one day burn this place to the ground. The mail was the most sacred and cruel event of the prison routine. It happened at 4 p.m, and from 3:30 onward, an almost palpable tension settled over the cell block. Conversations died down, eyes fixed on the metal door through which the guard would pass with the canvas bag. For most, it was a ritual of disappointment. For a few, it was the only proof that the outside world still remembered them. In the first few weeks, I expected nothing. Who would write to the news monster? My own family, I imagined, was dealing with shame, with the double grief of Mark's death and my downfall. I felt radioactive, a person whose name was too dangerous to write on an envelope. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when the guard began shouting the names, I heard it. "Thompson!" The word cut through the noise, and for a second, I didn't recognize it as my own. He repeated it impatiently. "Thompson, 734. The number anchored me back to reality. On shaky legs, I stood and walked over to it, feeling dozens of eyes on me, a mixture of envy and curiosity. The envelope was thin, the paper cheap. My name and number were written in my sister's hurried handwriting. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I didn't open it right away. That envelope was a fragile miracle, and I was afraid its contents might shatter. I held it to my chest, feeling the outline of something hard and rectangular inside, and found a corner in the courtyard, near a peeling wall where the sun rarely hit. It was my sanctuary of solitude. I sat on the cold floor and, with trembling, sweaty fingers, tore at the edge. My sister's letter was brief, full of careful words and phrases that said nothing and everything at the same time. "We're fine. He's healthy. Please stay strong." But I barely read the words. My eyes were fixed on the photo she'd enclosed. It was Leo. Wrapped in a blue blanket I'd knitted myself, he slept with a serenity that seemed to belong to another universe. His hair was a dark, downy mess on his head, his lips formed a small pout, and his tiny hand was clenched into a fist, as if he were already preparing to fight. The world around me faded. The noise from the courtyard, the screams, the distant sirens, everything dissolved into a profound silence. The only thing that existed was that small face. And for the first time since I arrived, a tear ran down my face, not from pain or anger, but from an emotion so overwhelming it had no name, a love so pure it physically ached. That photo became my talisman, my anchor to sanity. I taped it to the concrete wall next to my bed with a piece of chewed gum, transforming that small space into an altar. Every night after lights out, I whispered to it, I told her about the horrible food, the noise, Maria, and how much I missed her. It was a prayer to a God who had the face of my son. Yet that small piece of paper was a double-edged sword. It was both my salvation and my daily torture. Every time I looked at it, the reality of my situation crushed me anew. He was growing by the second, and I wasn't there. Each subsequent letter brought new stabs. He smiled for the first time. His first tooth came in. He said, "Mommy," looking at your picture. My sister thought she was giving me hope, but each milestone in his development was a reminder of what had been stolen from me. I was a spectator in my own son's life. And it was in this paradox of love and agony that a new determination began to form. Pain was no longer just a weakness. I would transform it into a weapon. I had to return to that boy, not just for myself, but for him. He deserved a mother, not a ghost in a photograph. My relationship with Maria deepened beyond mere survival. She became my teacher, my confidant, my moral compass in a place designed to destroy any sense of direction. Our encounters took place in the interstices of prison routine, in whispered conversations over the noisy laundry machines, in exchanged glances during countdowns, and most of all, in the prison library. The library was the only place where silence was a rule, not a threat. It was a refuge of rusted metal bookshelves and books with pages yellowed with age. It was Maria's territory. She spent hours there, reading everything from philosophy to detective novels. "The mind is the one place they can't lock away," she once told me, running a finger over the spine of a Viktor Frankl book. "You have to keep it sharp, or it rusts like these bars." For me, who always found solace in books, that place became our classroom, and Maria, my tutor in the art of resistance. One day, Sonia, the same woman who confronted me in the laundry room, cornered me in the hallway leading to the cafeteria. She accused me of stealing her place in the phone line, a serious offense under the inmate code of conduct. The accusation was false, a pretext for violence. I felt fear rise in my throat, but I remembered Maria's words. I stared at her, keeping my expression neutral, my body tense, but still. Before the situation could escalate, Maria's calm voice sounded behind me. "The problem isn't the phone, Sonia. Leave her alone." Sonia hesitated, then spat on the floor near my feet and walked away. Later in the library, Maria explained, "It's not about you, Claire. It's about what you represent. You arrived here broken, but you didn't give up. You still have letters, you have a family out there. You have hope. And to a woman like Sonia, who lost all that 20 years ago, your hope is an insult. She doesn't hate you. She hates the reflection of the woman she used to be." That lesson was a revelation. I began to see the other women not just as threats or fellow sufferers, but as mirrors of different possible futures. There were the Sonias, consumed by bitterness. There were the young women, filled with a bravado that hid terror. And there were the Marias, who had found a form of dignity and purpose even in the darkest circumstances. One night, in a rare moment of vulnerability, Maria told me a fragment of her own story. She spoke of the daughter she left behind, a girl who was now a 40-year-old woman with children of her own. "I haven't seen her in 15 years, Maria said, her eyes fixed on a distant point. "She forgave me, but I never forgave myself. And that, dear, is the only wall that truly matters." In that moment, our connection solidified beyond gratitude and respect. It was a bond of shared humanity. I realized that each woman there carried the weight of a before, a life that had been destroyed by a single mistake, a bad choice, or in my case, a lie. And understanding this didn't make me feel less alone, but it made me feel part of something bigger, a tragic and resilient sisterhood. Leo's first birthday loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. With each passing day, the pressure in my chest grew. I saw his face everywhere. In the face of a cherub in an old library book, in the smile of a younger guard talking about her own baby. The world seemed to conspire to remind me of what I was missing. On the day itself, I woke with a sense of dread. The prison routine, usually a welcome anesthesia, was torture that day. The sound of the morning bell sounded like a mocking scream. The breakfast food tasted like cardboard. In the courtyard, the sound of other women's laughter sounded sharp and cruel, like shards of glass in my ears. The gray prison walls had never felt so claustrophobic, the air never so thin. I felt as if I were drowning in slow motion, and no one could see. I needed to do something, Mark, that day. Honor my son, even if only to myself. The idea emerged like a faint beacon in the fog. I would bake him a cake. The execution was a clandestine operation. The night before, I traded my rarity of dessert cake for 2 stale pieces of bread with a woman working in the kitchen. During lunch, I used my only task of the week, cleaning one of the guards' rooms, to discreetly take 2 sachets of strawberry jam they'd left for breakfast. The risk was enormous. If caught, I would spend weeks in solitary confinement. But the fear of punishment paled in comparison to the necessity of performing this ritual. That night, after lights out and the tense silence that followed, I sat on the floor of my cell. With the dim light of the corridor as my only illumination, I set to work. I kneaded the breadcrumbs with a little water from the sink, shaping them into a small, imperfect circle. With my finger, I spread the red jelly over the top, the vibrant color seeming sacrilege in that monochromatic world. Finally, I broke a matchstick in half and stuck it in the center. My candle. With the pathetic cake in my hands, I closed my eyes. The image of Leo in his blue blanket filled my mind, and then, in a whisper so low it was almost inaudible, I sang, "Happy Birthday." My voice broke on the first word, and the tears I'd been holding back all day finally came, a silent flood that ran down my face and dripped onto the bread. I sang the entire song, each word a lump in my throat. When I finished, I blew out the imaginary candle, and then I ate. I ate every crumb of that cake of bread and tears. Each bite tasted of my guilt, my longing, my helpless love. It was an act of pure agony, a communion with the depths of my misery. And when I finished, when there was nothing left, I waited for the wave of despair that always came. But it didn't come. In its place was absolute emptiness, rock bottom. And from the bottom of that well, a single thought, cold and hard as a diamond, emerged. Never again. In that instant, the tears stopped. The victim in me died. I stared at Leo's photo on the wall, not with the sadness of a grieving mother, but with the cold promise of a warrior. That cake wasn't a celebration. It was a funeral. The funeral of the woman I was, and the birth of the woman I needed to become to get my life back. In the days following Leo's birthday, a strange stillness settled over me. It wasn't the stillness of resignation, but the cold calm of the eye of a hurricane. The woman who wept in the dark had been purged by the ritual of bread and tears. In her place, something new emerged, something harder and sharper. The change was internal, but its manifestations were visible. I began to walk with purpose, my back straight and my chin held high. My eyes, once lowered and frightened, now met the gazes of the other inmates and the guards, not with defiance, but with an impenetrable neutrality that left them disconcerted. Maria was the first to notice. "The fire in your eyes has changed," she observed one day, as we sorted uniforms in the laundry room. "Before, it was the fire of a burning house. Now it's the fire of a forge." She was right. The prison was no longer my cage. It had become my training ground, my university, my monastery. Every sound, every smell, every daily ritual was recontextualized. The clang of the steel doors was no longer the sound of my sentence, but the bell calling me to battle. The smell of bleach was no longer the smell of monotony, but the smell of cleanliness, of purifying my mind for the task ahead. My routine changed drastically. The hours I'd previously spent, lost in painful memories, were filled with iron discipline. Every morning, before the 5 o'clock bell, I was already on the floor of my cell, doing push-ups and sit-ups until my muscles burned, transforming the energy of my anger into physical strength. I needed a body that could withstand the war my mind was about to wage. I secured a job transfer from the laundry to the library, a coveted position that cost me weeks of good behavior and Maria's help. There, surrounded by the dusty silence, I didn't read novels to escape. I devoured law books, criminal procedure manuals, studies on forensic psychology. I learned the language of my enemy, the technical terms, the precedents, the loopholes. And at night, under the dim light of the corridor, I began writing in a notebook I'd obtained from the police station. It wasn't a diary of feelings. It was a diary of facts. I began recording every memory, no matter how trivial, from the 6 months leading up to Mark's death. The cheap soft-cover notebook became my research slate, the one place in the universe where I was free to be the detective of my own disaster. Over time, my perception of hope transformed. The hope I harbored in those early years was passive and childish, the belief that an external force, a brilliant lawyer, a compassionate judge, a divine miracle, would come to my rescue. That hope was a drug that kept me docile. The new hope I was forging was different. It was active, aggressive, strategic. It was the hope of an engineer building a bridge across a chasm, calculating every angle, testing every material. It wasn't about waiting for a miracle. It was about creating the conditions for a miracle to be inevitable. And the raw material for that construction wasn't in the appellate courts or the law firms. It was within me. In that cell, isolated from everything I loved, I was forced to stop looking outside for a savior and start digging inside for a weapon. My fractured memory, my painful past, there lay the key. I realized the crime scene wasn't our bedroom that fateful night. The real crime scene was my own mind. And I would have to be the only detective investigating it. The process of excavating my memories was the most arduous task I've ever undertaken. It was a work of emotional archaeology, trying to unearth the truth beneath layers of trauma, grief, and denial. Every night, I sat on my bunk, closed my eyes, and forced myself back in time. It wasn't a passive recollection. It was an active reconstruction. I focused on the sensory details to make the scenes vivid again. The smell of rosemary and roasted garlic in our kitchen, the feel of the cashmere fabric of Mark's favorite sweater, the sound of his deep laugh when I told a bad joke. These memories were simultaneously my heaven and my hell. Every detail that brought me closer to the truth also reminded me of the depth of my loss. There were nights when the pain was so intense I had to stop, gasping, my chest tight, feeling as if I were drowning in the past. But the image of Leo's face in the photograph pulled me back to the surface, reminding me why I was doing this. I wasn't revisiting my past to grieve. I was ransacking it for weapons. In one of these sessions, I forced myself to relive a specific dinner about a month before Mark's death. David and his wife were at our house. On the surface, the evening was pleasant. But with my new eyes, I began to see the cracks in the facade. I remembered the way David looked at our house, not with the admiration of a friend, but with the greed of a surveyor. I remembered a joke he'd made, which at the time seemed tasteless, but now sounded like an ominous prophecy. He raised his wine glass and said, "To Mark, the only man I know worth more dead than alive, thanks to that company life insurance." We all laughed, a strained, uncomfortable laugh. Mark didn't laugh. He just smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I remembered their conversation later on the porch, voices low and strained. I couldn't hear the words, but the body language said it all. Mark, rigid and accusatory. David, his hands raised in a gesture of feigned innocence. I jotted down every detail in my notebook. The joke, the tension, the look. Dots that had previously been isolated in the darkness began to connect, forming a constellation of betrayal. Reflecting on this brought a new layer of guilt, but it was a productive guilt, not a paralyzing one. How could I have been so blind? The answer was simple and painful. I was in love. Love had been a filter that softened the edges, that made me believe in the best versions of people, that whispered to me that Mark's worries were just work stress. Love had made me an unreliable witness to my own life. I had to forgive myself for this blindness in order to move on. And then, in the midst of this self-analysis, a fragment of memory, previously insignificant, burst into my mind with the clarity of a lightning bolt. It was a night, perhaps a week before everything happened. Mark was at his desk, his diary open, writing furiously. He looked pale and agitated. I asked if everything was okay. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a fear I had never seen before. "If something happens to me, Claire," he began, his voice low, "it's all here. The numbers don't lie." I tried to calm him down, telling him he was working too hard. But now his words echoed in my mind with a terrifying weight. The diary wasn't just an emotional refuge. It was a ledger. It was his proof. It was his will. The memory of Mark's words, "The numbers don't lie," ignited a feverish urgency within me. I needed to see the diary again. Not the few pages the prosecutor had used against me, but every word, every number, every scrawl. The battle to gain access was a bureaucratic nightmare. My public defender, the same man whose resignation had condemned me, greeted me with weary skepticism. "Claire, the case is closed," he said over the grainy visiting room phone. "The diary has been reviewed. There's nothing there." This time I didn't accept his defeat. My voice was cold, sharp, devoid of the hysteria he'd expected. "I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm instructing you to file a motion for full access to the evidence. It's my right." The change in my tone surprised him. He reluctantly agreed. The weeks that followed were a torture of waiting, each day an eternity. Hope and despair warred within me. What if there was nothing? What if it was just the illusion of a desperate mind? Doubt was a poison, and I had to fight it every day. Finally, the day arrived. I was summoned to the visiting room, not the noisy room with the thick glass, but a small conference room reserved for lawyers. A thick manila envelope, nearly 4 inches tall, lay on the metal table. It was the photocopies. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. A guard stood at the door, his face impassive. I had 2 hours. I opened the envelope and spread the hundreds of pages out on the table. Mark's familiar handwriting hit me like a punch. I took a deep breath, pushing back the wave of grief, and got to work. I read methodically, ignoring the emotional passages the prosecutor had highlighted. I was searching for anomalies, for patterns, for the secret language of a man in fear. Hour after hour, I read. My eyes burned. The hum of the fluorescent light was the only soundtrack. I was almost giving up hope when I found it. It was hidden in a section on financial projections, looking like a random note. A line of code, Act D7B, Sec. Ledger, Def 900K. At first, it didn't make sense. But then, like puzzle pieces falling into place, I understood. I cross-referenced the note with other entries. Mark often referred to David as D in his quick notes. Sec. Ledger, a second ledger, a secret book, and Def 900K, a deficit, a $900,000 hole. It wasn't an accounting error. It was a massive embezzlement. David wasn't just stealing. He was sinking the company. Mark had found out. The room began to spin. The buzzing lights seemed to grow louder. Everything fell into place. The arguments, Mark's stress, his paranoia, David's joke at dinner. Mark wasn't killed in a fit of jealous rage. It was a corporate execution. A cold, calculated act to silence the one person who could send him to prison for life. The euphoria of discovery lasted only a second before being replaced by icy terror. I had the truth. But the truth was a double-edged sword. David had killed once to protect this secret. What would he do with the woman who unearthed it? In that moment, I knew the fight for my freedom had also become a fight for my life. Possessing the truth was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I felt a surge of power, a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I held the key. On the other, the weight of that knowledge was crushing and dangerous. The prison, which for 6 years had been my cage and the symbol of my powerlessness, suddenly seemed the only place in the world where I was temporarily safe, a cruel paradox. The logic was simple. David wanted me silenced. If he knew I knew, what would stop him from trying to reach me from within? Prison is a porous system, with corruptible guards and inmates willing to do anything for a favor or a few dollars in their commissary. A new paranoia, sharp and watchful, took hold of me. Every glance from a guard I didn't know, every new inmate arriving at my cell, every whisper in a dark corner felt like a potential threat. I felt like a bearer of both a plague and a cure, and I didn't know which would destroy me first. I needed help, but trust was the rarest currency in that place. The only person I could risk was Maria. I found her in our usual spot, a secluded corner of the courtyard, behind the water tanks, where the camera surveillance was spotty. Heart pounding, I revealed everything. I showed her the copy of the diary page, whispering my interpretation of the code, connecting it to Mark's death. She listened silently, her face a mask of concentration. When I finished, she showed no surprise, only a deep gravity. "I always knew you weren't a murderer," she said. "You don't have the eyes for it. But this—" She touched the paper. "This is a death note, Claire. If you deliver this through the normal channels, they'll bury it and bury you along with it in the hole for causing trouble." She told me my only chance was an unlikely alliance. Mrs. Evans, the guard. Maria explained that years ago, Evans's son was the victim of a drunk driver, a wealthy man who used his influence to get a minimal sentence. Ever since, Evans has harbored a silent but deep contempt for the way justice can be bought. "She hates bullies and liars more than she hates us," Maria concluded. Approaching Mrs. Evans was the biggest risk I ever took. For days, I watched her, waiting for the right moment. Finally, it happened during the nightly cleaning of the administrative corridor. The hallway was empty. My breath caught in my throat. I walked up to her, pushing my mop, and without making eye contact, whispered, "Mrs. Evans, I need help. This isn't about breaking the rules. This is about a murder that was covered up." I could feel her eyes on me, her posture stiffening. She said nothing. I dropped a folded note on the floor near her foot, containing the copy of the diary page and the phrase, "Numbers don't lie," and I walked away. The days that followed were torture. Every time I saw Mrs. Evans, she completely ignored me. Despair began to set in. I had made a terrible mistake. I had exposed myself, and now I was alone and vulnerable. Maybe Maria was wrong. Maybe no one could be trusted. And in the back of my mind, a terrifying question. What if Evans was in David's pocket? Just as I was about to give up, the signal came. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. During the mail distribution, Mrs. Evans passed me and, without breaking stride, dropped an envelope from the stack she was carrying. It landed at my feet. My name wasn't on it. It was a blank return envelope, the kind used by the prison administration. But inside, when I opened it later, in the privacy of my cell, was a single postage stamp. 1. That was all. The message was clear. You have one chance. Don't waste it. That night, the prison fell asleep in its usual routine of coughs and murmurs. But for me, the night was alive with an electric energy. I was ready. In the dim light leaking from the hallway, I set up my war station on the floor of my cell. The notebook, the pencil I'd been sharpening by gnawing on the tip, and the precious sheets of paper I'd been saving. The world shrank to that small circle of light and purpose. I didn't write a letter of supplication. It wasn't a victim's lament. It was a manifesto, a dossier, an act of accusation. I began with the sentence, "My name is Claire Thompson, number 734. And I am serving a life sentence for a crime the Iowa police never bothered to investigate." With the precision of a surgeon, I dissected the case. I presented Mark's diary page as the centerpiece, decoding the entry and explaining what it signified, an embezzlement of nearly $1 million by his partner, David. I connected it to facts only I could know. The tense arguments, the sudden change in David's lifestyle, the haste with which Mark's life insurance policy was used to save the company after his death. I didn't use emotional language. I used the language of facts, of numbers, of cold logic I learned from law books. "I don't ask you to believe me," I wrote. "I urge you to believe Mark. The truth is in your own numbers. Follow the money, and you will find the monster who isn't behind bars. I spent hours on each paragraph, reading and rewriting, ensuring that every word was a stone, building a wall of evidence so solid it would be impossible to ignore. When the final version was ready, transcribed in my finest handwriting on a single sheet of paper, I felt a profound exhaustion, but also a sense of peace. For 6 years, my voice had been stolen. That night, I found it again. That letter wasn't just paper and ink. It was my soul, my rage, my love for Leo, all distilled into an irrefutable argument. It was my true trial, and I was the prosecutor, the witness, and the jury. The next morning, I handed the sealed envelope to Maria. She took it with an almost religious solemnity. It would pass through a clandestine network of jail mail from one inmate to the next until it reached a former inmate who worked as a cleaner in an office building and dropped it in the mail. It was a fragile system based on loyalty and old debts. It was a long shot. As the letter left my hands, I felt a mixture of terror and liberation. I had lit the fuse. Now, all I could do was wait for the explosion. Waiting was the most exquisite form of torture. Each day dragged on with excruciating slowness. The prison routine I had mastered was now background noise to the cacophony of my anxiety. Every count, every meal, every shift in the library was tinged with the same obsessive question. Did the letter arrive? Did he read it? Did he believe it? Doubt was an acid, corroding my newfound resolve. I began to see flaws in my plan. Perhaps the letter had been intercepted. Perhaps the journalist, a famous and busy man, had dismissed it as the delusion of yet another prisoner claiming innocence. Hope, once such a strong flame, began to waver, threatening to extinguish. My only solace was the TV in the common room, perpetually tuned to a 24-hour news channel. I would spend hours there, pretending to read, but with my ears open, my heart pounding with each new segment, waiting for a name, a face, anything. The other women looked at me curiously, but I maintained my mask of indifference. No one except Maria knew about the ticking time bomb I had sent into the world. And then, on a Tuesday, almost 3 weeks after the letter was sent, the bombshell exploded. The cafeteria was in its usual chaos, the clatter of metal trays, loud conversations, the smell of stew. I was pushing food around on my plate, lost in my dark thoughts, when one of the inmates working in administration rushed in, her face pale with excitement. "Turn on the TV! Channel 7!" she shouted. Someone turned up the volume. And there it was, the journalist's face, live, in front of the Polk County Courthouse. Behind him, a blown-up image of a page from my diary. My heart sank. The room fell silent. The journalist's voice was serious and resonant. Anonymous sources have provided us with what appears to be shocking new evidence in the case of Claire Thompson, the woman convicted in 2019 of murdering her husband. An entry from the victim's own diary suggests a financial motive and points to a suspect who has never been properly investigated by police. The camera focused on David's face. And then, mine. The cafeteria was so quiet, you could have heard a pin drop. Every fork, every spoon had stopped in midair. And then slowly, like a wave, over 100 heads turned in my direction. In that moment, everything changed. I was no longer number 734, the quiet, invisible husband killer. I was the woman on television, the woman who could be innocent. The power in the cafeteria and in the entire prison had shifted. The guards who passed me now looked away, uncomfortable. The prison warden, a woman who had never spoken to me, summoned me to her office, her face a mixture of fury at the breach of protocol and fear of the repercussions. The outside world had invaded the walls of my prison. Reporters camped outside. My name was in every newspaper. The State Attorney General's office announced the opening of a formal review of my case. For years, time had stood still, and now, suddenly, it was moving at dizzying speed. The feeling was dizzying, a mixture of triumph and dread. I had done it. The walls were shaking. But amid the euphoria, a cold truth settled in my heart. I had exposed a murderer, a man who had everything to lose, and he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, who had lit the fire that now threatened to consume him. My victory left me more vulnerable than ever. The news that David had requested a visit sent shockwaves through the pavilion. The warden summoned me again, this time with an almost maternal concern in her voice, assuring me I could refuse. But refusing was the last thing I wanted. For 7 years, his version of the story had defined my life. Now it was my turn to define his. The visiting room, normally a place of noisy and emotional encounters, was emptied for us. 2 extra guards were posted discreetly in the corners. The atmosphere was charged, not with the smell of disinfectant, but with the smell of gunpowder about to ignite. As I waited, sitting in the cold plastic chair, I felt no fear. The fear belonged to the woman I once was. What I felt was an icy calm, the clarity of a predator patiently waiting for its prey. I had spent years rehearsing this moment in my mind, and now the stage was set. He walked in, and the change in him was shocking. The arrogant, charming man I knew was gone. In his place was a haunted man with dark circles under his eyes, his expensive suit seeming too big on his hunched shoulders. He sat on the other side of the thick glass, the same glass that separated me from Leo, and picked up his phone. I picked up mine. His first tactic was false familiarity. "Claire," he began, his voice trying to sound warm. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to stop. Think about Mark. He wouldn't want this." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch. My lack of reaction threw him off balance. He shifted to threat. "You have no idea who you've messed with. The people I owed money to. They won't just forget. You put your family in danger." I remained silent, letting his empty words crash against the wall of my calm. Finally, he reached for the plea, the final tactic of a desperate man. "Please, Claire, for God's sake, tell them you made a mistake. I'll help you. I'll get you out of here. I'll give you money, whatever you want." It was then that I spoke. My voice, when it came out, was low, controlled, and sharp as a shard of glass. "Money?" I repeated, and a humorless smile touched my lips. "It was for money that you put a bullet in your best friend's head while he slept. It was for money that you let me rot here for 7 years while my son grew up calling me a photograph." His eyes widened. The veneer of control he still had shattered. "You can't prove anything," he hissed, his voice shrill. I leaned forward, placing my hand on the cold glass, as if I could touch it. "I don't need it anymore, David. My letter has already done its job. I spent the last few years in a cell, but you spent your entire life in a prison of greed and lies. You speak of trial? Mine is over. The real trial, the one under the spotlight, where every one of your dirty secrets will be exposed for the world to see. That, David, hasn't even begun yet." I hung up the phone and stood up. As I left the room, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel his gaze on my back, the gaze of a man who had just been convicted, not by a jury, but by the only witness to his crime. The confrontation with David was the final domino to fall. His visit, a desperate attempt at intimidation, was recorded and used against him as evidence of witness tampering. His fragile denial crumbled under the weight of the reopened investigation. The secret ledger was found. The offshore accounts were tracked. The web of lies he'd woven for years was unraveled, thread by thread. In prison, I existed in a surreal state of limbo. I was the center of everything, and at the same time, completely isolated. The other inmates treated me with a new reverence, keeping their distance as if my situation were contagious, a mixture of good and bad luck. I spent my days in the library, no longer researching, but reading novels, trying to reconnect with a world of stories other than my own. The battle was won. Now I was just waiting for the bureaucracy to catch up with the truth. The day of my freedom arrived not with a clap of thunder, but with the stillness of falling snow. It was Mrs. Evans who came to fetch me from the library. She wasn't in uniform. She wore a simple dress. "Claire, the district attorney is here." "It's time," she said softly. We went to the principal's office. The room was austere, impersonal. The district attorney, a woman I'd only seen on TV, didn't look me in the eye. She read an official document in a monotone. The words, discharged of all charges, miscarriage of justice, immediate release, sounding distant, as if they were about someone else. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. They expected tears of joy, perhaps gratitude. What they sensed was my exhaustion. A single tear rolled down my face, not of joy, but of a weariness so deep it seemed to come from the soul. I had moved a mountain, and now all I wanted was to sleep for a century. I looked at Mrs. Evans, and she gave me a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the journey we had traveled together. Two women on opposite sides of a broken system, united by the pursuit of a simple truth. As I packed my few belongings into a cardboard box, the irony of the situation struck me. 7 years of my life, erased by a signature on a piece of paper. The state offered me a formal apology and financial compensation, as if they could put a price on my son's first steps, his first smiles, every night I didn't put him to bed. In that moment, I realized that true justice doesn't exist in the courts. Legal justice is only a rough approximation, an imperfect mechanism. True justice is internal. It's the peace that comes from claiming your own narrative, from forcing the truth to come to light, even if you're the only one who sees it. I grabbed Leo's faded photograph, the philosophy book Maria gave me, and the worn notebook that became my weapon and my map. I wasn't leaving prison as the same woman who entered. I entered as a victim. I was leaving as a survivor, and most importantly, as a mother about to meet her son for the first time. The final hallway seemed longer than I remembered. Each footstep echoed in the silence, a hollow sound marking the end of an era. I passed the pavilion, and through the bars, I saw Maria. She said nothing, just placed her hand over her heart and waved. It was a farewell and a blessing. At the last door, Mrs. Evans was waiting. "Good luck, Claire," she said, and for the first time, I saw a glimpse of a smile on her face. Then, the steel gate creaked open, the same sound that had once sealed my fate. Sunlight hit me with the force of a blow, and I staggered, raising my hand to shield my eyes that had grown accustomed to the dim light. And then I breathed, the first breath of fresh air. It smelled of wet grass after rain, hot asphalt, life. The world was so vast, the sky so open, that I felt small and overwhelmed. The colors seemed painfully vibrant, the street sounds an overwhelming cacophony. It was terrifying, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt. Across the parking lot, leaning against a car, was my sister. Older, with silver strands in her hair that hadn't been there before, but with the same loving smile. And beside her, holding her hand, was him, Leo, my son. He wasn't the baby in the picture anymore. He was a real boy with scraped knees, tousled hair, and Mark's eyes filled with cautious curiosity. My heart felt too big for my chest. I walked slowly toward them, each step feeling like a mile. I didn't run. I didn't crush him in a hug. I knelt on the asphalt to be at his level, so as not to scare him. He looked at me, his small face serious. "Are you my mother?" he asked, his voice small and clear. A sob caught in my throat. "Yes," I whispered. "I am." He was silent for a moment, studying me, and then he stepped forward and touched my face with his small hand, as if to confirm that I was real. And in that touch, 7 years of pain, anger, and longing dissolved. I pulled him into a hug, and he didn't pull away. He hugged me back, and I cried, finally, the tears of joy they couldn't steal from me. Months have passed. Rebuilding a life is a slow, silent work. There are good days when Leo's laughter fills the house and I forget the sound of keys. And there are difficult days when a loud noise startles me or the silence of the night seems oppressive. But little by little, I'm coming back to myself. I discovered that prison took 7 years from me, but gave me a strength I didn't know I had. I learned that faith isn't about waiting for the storm to pass, but learning to dance in the rain. I learned that the hardest and most important forgiveness is the one you grant yourself. Sometimes God doesn't open the cell. He changes who we are inside. My story isn't about a crime or a conviction. It's about the indomitable power of a mother's love and the discovery that true freedom isn't about leaving a prison, but finding peace within your own heart. If you've ever felt trapped by something you didn't do, if you've ever felt your voice silenced by injustice, this story is yours too. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even in the deepest silence, truth can still find a way to scream, and that even the most imprisoned soul can one day learn to fly. In the end, I realized that not every prison has bars, and not every kind of freedom means being outside. For years, I believed justice lived in courtrooms, but I've learned it's born in the quiet corners of the heart when we choose not to be consumed by hatred. Pain taught me what no book ever could, that truth doesn't need to be believed to be real, and that there's dignity even in being forgotten. Today, I understand that the meaning of life isn't to win, but to remain whole, even when everything falls apart. Faith didn't open my cell door, but it helped me see beauty in the small lights, in the sound of morning, the smell of old paper, the memory of my child. And maybe that's what freedom truly is. Not escaping the darkness, but learning to walk through it without losing your soul. If this story made you reflect, share it with someone who also carries invisible scars. Write in the comments, what does freedom mean to you? Your words might light the way for someone else. And if you want to keep hearing stories of pain, faith, and new beginnings, subscribe to the channel and walk with me into the next chapter.